Hello, everybody. Once again, I'm Lee McCrafton Jr., aka Zorvalchan Less Than Guru. Right here, we have Mars the Video Cat, who's just tails in frame. But today, for Palladium First Edition tips, tricks, occupations, which I'm going through, I'm going to do my first academic category occupation, Mystic Scholar. So, the base framework is based off of the monk occupational character class from Palladium first edition. It's very different than the monk from second edition. Second edition monk is a martial artist type. The monk from first edition was a pacifist who would not cast magic, would not fight, or even really do anything but try to dodge, because any type of active combat, even if it was parrying, was considered by them to ripple out towards the old ones and possibly wake them up, which is a horrible thing to do in Palladium world, or the Palladium megaverse in general. You don't want to wake up the great old ones. The minor old ones are bad enough. So, since that mythology does not exist in my world of Zordaria, even though I use various chunks out of other games, like part of my Zordaria world is the Nintir Vale from D&D 4th edition, which I've transplanted into Zordaria. The mythos I kept the same as the mythos that I've been using ever since I started Palladium back in the late 80s. So, Mystic Scholar, I decided to have that pacifist be an option, but an option not necessarily. And also, they are ones who study magic and possibly can learn spells. So that's a major difference. So if you're going by a hardcore keeping Palladium lore the same, this is a class, if you even look at as a possible suggestion, maybe you do it as a different class from the monk and still have the monk, or maybe you just take pieces of this occupation and use it towards the monk. So the Mystic Scholar is dedicated to the pursuit of mystical knowledge. Unlike the wizard and symbologist, which the symbologist we'll get into on another episode is my combination of Diabolist and Summoner, they cannot perform magic. So and what that means is they automatically can't gain magic. They don't start off with anything, unlike the other ones. It's akin to having theoretical knowledge but lacking the ability to make it practical knowledge, or like a person who learns to speak another language but isn't unable to read or write it. So basically, they kind of start off with knowing certain fundamentals about magic, but they don't know how to cast spells to begin with. Attribute requirement is an IQ of 14, which is one of the higher IQs. So even though they don't start off with the spells of a wizard, they have potential to gain a lot. And we'll see how that goes. So alignment is any, but if you choose the pacifist, I require good or unprincipled. So kind of the flip side of all the evil alignments or evil and selfish alignment ones, you have to be good or unprincipled to choose the evasive combat, which is based off of the monk. I can't remember what that combat chart for hand-to-hand chart is called, but I call it evasive combat. And maybe they called it evasive combat. I just don't remember right off the top of my head. They don't get any physical conditioning, and that's how most, but not all of the academics are. They're studious. They're not building up their bodies to get into this occupation. They're building up their mind. So they don't get any physical conditioning. And this is one of the things where I really do separate men of arms versus men of magic, is that those of arms get a slight higher starting base of shock points. If you wanted to use that for hit points, I've said in my why do I use shock points as well as hit points and not SDC, got an episode about that. The one thing I wanted to do is I wanted to make sure that the base men of arms were better physically than the base academics and magic users. So that's why they don't get anything. Armor tier is tier 3. They're not trained in armor. They can wear armor and they can take penalties for light and even more penalties for heavy, but they don't gain the abilities of they get penalties, I'll say. They Whereas men of arms get to ignore either light and or heavy armor penalties. So restrictions kind of going up here. Mystic scholars who choose evasive combat cannot choose any hand-to-hand combat, ranged combat, or thrown combat. So they don't get any of that. If they do, they lose all their evasive combat training. So I do have it as this mentality of being a pacifist is going to give them certain bonuses to dodge, and they're the one occupation that I pulled roll with a punch fall over from other Palladium games into Palladium First Edition. So it's kind of a mystical academic thing, a certain way that they learn how to get away with stuff based off of their philosophy. And if their philosophy changes, then they would lose that and are never able to go back. If a character becomes a mystic scholar, they may only choose evasive combat if they have no prior hand-to-hand combat, range combat, or thrown combat, which would probably be pretty difficult to go. Occupational skills, they do get scroll conversion. And when we get into some of the skills, I'll explain how I do scroll conversions to also be Grimoire. And I do have a video on that as well as my Grimoire, how I suggest game masters introducing Grimoire spell books into their game, and how I have it it's based off of scroll conversion, but it gives bonuses because it's a physical book. The spells aren't going to disappear. If a character or scroll conversion, they can speak in additional languages, read, write native. They get magic defenses. So even if they don't get a magic combat, they'll get magic defenses. And when we get into combat and non-evasive, that will show up, as well as over here. One of the abilities is just by knowing so much about magic, they prepare themselves to not be affected by magic as well. So that is one of their bonuses. And then they choose either hand-to-hand general or evasive combat as an option. So if they're going with the non-passive, or they're going with the pacifist non-aggression, they're going to choose evasive combat. If they decide they want to be a mystic scholar who actually fights, then they go with hand-to-hand general. So that's kind of the difference. And they do get a hand-to-hand skill, whether that's a getting out of hand-to-hand and not doing it skill, or an actual fighting skill. And that is a trade-off against the wizards who don't start off with a hand-to-hand skill. They can choose it as an option, but they're not given it to it, but they start off with spells. So if we look here at the level chart, they are the absolute knowledge-based skills character class, occupation. So every single level, they get one or two skills, and whether that's secondary or elective, they get skills. So they will be even more so than, say, like the bard, or the spy, or one of them gets a lot of skills. That's what these guys, every single level, they get a new skill. They learn. They're like knowledge sponges. Elective skills, secondary skills work the same as Palladium. Elective skills, these are the skills that you can get, and secondary skills, or you can choose any secondary skills, but these are the skills that you get bonuses to. And the one thing that they can pick up some without evasive combat. So if they don't go the evasive combat range or the combat way, they can get ranged combat general or thrown combat general as a skill choice. And then weapon proficiency is, if you choose that evasive, you can't get weapon proficiencies based off of it, but otherwise they could get a few in there. So let's look at the abilities, because the abilities are all given to them at the beginning that they are allowed to do. None of them is based off of a level. So magic defense is the Mystic Scholar gains mystical defenses, which are usable in all stances. and then they get a certain amount of magic points, which is kind of my ISP or my PPE equivalent in Palladium. So they start off with some magic points and they'll gain magic points. And then if they get and find and learn spells, then they use those to fuel it. And then we have Wizardly Pursuit. The mystical scholar doesn't start off with spells, but can learn them exactly like a wizard, with the exception that they can only learn spells equal or less than their level. So if you have a mystic scholar that is level 2, they can only learn level 1 and 2 wizard spells. Where a wizard is the only occupation that could learn any spell at any level, but they can only cast it up to their wizard level. Um, and they don't have to go into a mystic stance, is the other thing that's slightly different with this. I talked about my 4 stances, and they can just cast a spell. So they can, if they go into what I have no stance, you don't have a stance at all. You get 1 action per round. Then you can cast that spell. So that is kind of their thing. And then here on the experience chart, as a reminder, the one in red is how much XP you need if you attain a level and then you stop a current occupation and you're trying to get to a new occupation. To get to level 1, you have to build up experience, and that's the one that I have in red. But every single level that they gain within Mystic Scholar, they get some type of bonus. So to begin with, they get a +2 versus spells and prayers at level 2 versus circles and wards, +1 versus insanity at level 3, and so on up to when they get a +3 versus psychic, +4 versus insanity, 4 versus circles and wards, and 6 versus spells and prayers. So without being in any mystical stance or whatever, their knowledge of magic allows them protection against different mystical, not just magic, but all mystical types of attacks against them. And that's where their bonus is defensive, and it works well with the evasive combat. So that is my Mystic Scholar. I took a core of the monk, and I added some types of learning spells. They don't get spells automatically as they level up. They have to find and learn those. But they get some magic points to use to cast once they learn it. And throughout their progression, they will learn skills and they will get defenses versus this various mystical attacks. Having said that, once again, I'm Liam McCrafton Jr., aka Zorvach on Less Than Guru. And until next time, I will catch you later.